America's Deadliest Females. Behind the Facade. This video contains discussions of true crime cases that may be distressing for some viewers. The events described involve real people and real tragedies. Out of respect for the victims and their families, this content has been carefully researched and presented with sensitivity. Viewer discretion is advised. Throughout history, certain criminal cases have challenged our understanding of human nature and society. Today, we'll explore the stories of America's deadliest women, cases that shocked the nation and reshaped law enforcement, forensics, and even the way we view female criminals. From poisoners to cold-blooded killers, these stories are as haunting as they are fascinating. Behind every case were real people, victims whose lives were cut short, families who suffered immense loss, and communities forever changed by these events. As we dive into each case, remember to subscribe to the channel for more true crime stories and discussions. Let's begin. Our journey begins with one of the most disturbing figures in true crime history, a nurse who betrayed her patient's trust in the most horrifying ways imaginable. I went to a garage estate sale in Lowell, Massachusetts, of an old physician I knew by reputation, and found an old collection of medical journals in a cardboard box. Amongst the collection was a dusty, leather-bound book with faded writing on the cover. It wasn't a journal or a medical text, but a scrapbook filled with newspaper clippings and handwritten notes about one of the most chilling figures in Massachusetts history. Her name was Jane Toppin, but she was better known as Jolly Jane, a nurse who turned her bedside care into a twisted form of murder. What I discovered in those pages was both horrifying and fascinating, a story of betrayal, manipulation, and death. Tonight, I'll take you through the life and crimes of Jane Toppin, a woman whose cheerful demeanor hid an unfathomable darkness. Jane Toppin was born Honora Kelly in 1857 in Boston, Massachusetts. Her early life was marred by tragedy. Her mother died of tuberculosis when Jane was a child, and her alcoholic father, known as Kelly the Crack, was infamous for his erratic behavior. Family lore claims he once tried to sew his own eyelids shut. Unable to care for his children, he abandoned Jane and her sister at an orphanage when Jane was just 6 years old. The sisters were separated, and Jane was taken in as an indentured servant by the Toppin family, where she eventually adopted their last name. Despite these hardships, Jane grew into a bright, charismatic young woman, known for her wit and cheerful personality. But beneath her jolly exterior, darker impulses were brewing. Jane began her career in medicine in her early 20s, training to be a nurse at Cambridge Hospital. Patients and colleagues loved her for her friendly demeanor and sharp sense of humor. She earned the nickname Jolly Jane for her ability to lift spirits, even in the bleakest of circumstances. But Jane's charm masked a growing fascination with death. She wasn't content to simply care for the sick. She wanted to control life and death itself. By the 1880s, Jane had begun experimenting on her patients. She used her access to medications to test the effects of morphine and atropine, two drugs with opposite effects on the nervous system. Jane would administer carefully measured doses to her patients, pushing their bodies to the brink of death before reviving them. These weren't clinical experiments or acts of mercy. Jane later admitted she derived sexual gratification from watching her patients die. She described the process as a thrill and said she enjoyed lying beside her victims, holding them as they took their final breaths. Her victims were often vulnerable individuals, elderly patients, terminally ill people, or those who trusted her care. Jane was known to stay close to her victims in their final moments, earning her a reputation as a compassionate nurse. But her motives were anything but kind. Jane admitted that her murders weren't always premeditated. Sometimes, she simply decided on a whim that it was someone's time to die. "It's my duty," she would later say in interviews, "to relieve them of their suffering." Her first known murder was in the early 1890s, but it wasn't until years later that the true extent of her crimes would come to light. Jane's reign of terror reached its peak when she began targeting people she knew personally. In 1899, she poisoned her landlord, Israel Dunham, and his wife, allegedly because they had become an inconvenience. In 1901, Jane moved in with her foster sister, Elizabeth Brigham, who had been suffering from depression. Rather than offer support, Jane decided to kill her, later claiming she wanted to see what it felt like to murder someone she loved. Elizabeth's death was ruled a stroke, and Jane even attended her funeral, playing the role of a grieving sister. But Jane didn't stop there. She moved in with the Davis family, longtime friends of hers, to care for the widowed matriarch, Alden Davis. Within weeks, Jane poisoned Alden, his 2 daughters, and his sister. She later admitted that she enjoyed the attention she received as the grieving family's caregiver, even as she quietly killed them one by one. Jane's methods were calculated and cold. She would mix poisons into food and drink, using her medical knowledge to mask the symptoms. When one of her victims, Mary Gibbs, became suspicious of her sudden illness, Jane dismissed it as nerves and continued poisoning her until she died. Despite her growing body count, Jane managed to evade suspicion for years. Her victims' deaths were often attributed to natural causes or pre-existing conditions, thanks in part to her skill at manipulating medical records and fabricating symptoms. What finally brought Jane Toppin to justice was her hubris. In 1901, after killing several members of the Davis family, Alden Davis's surviving relatives demanded an investigation. An autopsy revealed high levels of morphine and atropine in the victims' bodies, leading authorities to question Jane. During the investigation, her former employers at Cambridge Hospital began to come forward with stories of suspicious deaths under her care. A pattern emerged. Jane had left a trail of at least 31 murders, though she later claimed the number was closer to 100. Jane's arrest shocked the nation. How could a woman so beloved by her patients and colleagues commit such heinous acts? During her trial, Jane confessed to the murders with chilling detachment. She described her experiments in detail, even admitting that she got a sexual thrill from watching her victims die. She showed no remorse, stating that her only regret was not killing more people. Her defense argued that she was insane, and in 1902, Jane was found not guilty by reason of insanity. She was committed to the Taunton State Hospital, where she spent the rest of her life. Even in the hospital, Jane remained a subject of fascination. Staff members described her as charming and witty, often making jokes about her murders. She seemed to revel in her notoriety, reportedly saying, "I have killed more people than any man or woman who ever lived." Despite her cheerful demeanor, her mental state continued to deteriorate. She became increasingly paranoid, believing the hospital staff was trying to poison her. Jane died in 1938 at the age of 81, taking with her the full truth of her crimes. What makes Jane Toppin's story so disturbing is the contrast between her public persona and her private actions. To her patients, She was Jolly Jane, a comforting presence in their final days. But to those who knew her darker side, she was a cold-blooded killer who used her medical knowledge to satisfy her twisted desires. Her crimes highlight the dangers of misplaced trust, especially in those we depend on the most. As I closed the scrapbook, I couldn't shake the image of Jane Toppin, a woman who turned the act of caregiving into a weapon. Her story is a chilling reminder that evil can hide behind a smile, and that even those who seem to bring comfort can harbor the darkest of intentions. For those who lived in Massachusetts during her reign of terror, Jane Toppin was more than a nurse. She was a nightmare in plain sight, leaving a legacy of death and deception that continues to haunt history. It began in the attic, that forgotten, dust-choked space where the past lay hidden. I had been helping my grandmother clear out her old house in LaPorte, Indiana, a home that had stood through generations of family history. The attic was filled with relics of a time long gone. Yellowed photographs, trunks with broken latches, and furniture draped in moth-eaten sheets. That's when I found it. A leather-bound journal. Its cover cracked and worn, lay buried beneath a stack of newspapers from the early 1900s. The air seemed to shift as I picked it up, and the weight of it was almost unnerving. Brushing off decades of dust, I uncovered the faded inscription on the first page. April 15th, 1908. What I thought would be an afternoon of cleaning turned into a descent into one of America's darkest legends. This journal wasn't just any journal. It belonged to my grandmother's aunt, a woman who had lived next door to Belle Gunness, the infamous Beast of LaPorte. April 16th, 1908.
Something terrible happened at the Gunness farm last night. The whole town is talking about the fire. Sheriff Smutzer came by asking questions about Belle. Martha next door says they found bodies in the ash. But that's not even the worst of it. They're digging in her yard now. Joe from the general store says they found a man's boot with a foot still in it.
Growing up, I'd heard whispers about Belle. Stories traded like campfire tales on cold Indiana nights. But this journal was different. It was a first-hand account, its pages trembling with fear, disbelief, and horror from someone who had lived through it. Belle Gunness moved to LaPorte in 1901, a widow with 3 children in tow. At first, she seemed like any other newcomer, eager to build a life in the quiet farming community. But there was something about her that unsettled people. She was tall, broad-shouldered, and strong, a commanding presence who rarely smiled. Her neighbors described her as hardworking, but distant, a woman who preferred the company of her farm animals to idle chatter. Not long after her arrival, tragedy struck. Belle's original farmhouse burned to the ground. She claimed the fire was an accident, and with the insurance payout, she rebuilt on the same property, a larger, more prosperous-looking home. This pattern followed Belle throughout her life. Misfortune always seemed to strike, yet she emerged unscathed, richer, and more powerful. Her second husband, Peter Gunness, died in a bizarre accident. Struck by a falling meat grinder, she said. His family didn't believe her, but Belle was never charged. Instead, she collected another hefty insurance check and continued her life as though nothing had happened. April 28th, 1908.
They say it's worse than anyone imagined. The sheriff's men keep digging, and the number of bodies keeps growing. Poor Ray Lamphere is in custody, but folks are whispering that Belle planned it all. Some say she's not even dead. The headless body in the ruins, it wasn't her.
That's when the men started arriving. Belle's courting system was simple but effective. She placed ads in Norwegian-language newspapers, seeking wealthy suitors for marriage. Lonely men from across the country responded, bringing their life savings to her farm in hopes of a fresh start. None of them ever left. Neighbors began noticing strange things. Belle bought large quantities of lye, a chemical used to dissolve organic material. At night, foul odors drifted from her hog pen. Men were seen arriving at her farm, but no one ever saw them leave. One of those men was Andrew Helgelian. He came from South Dakota, lured by Belle's promises of love and prosperity. When his letters to his brother stopped abruptly, the family demanded answers, and authorities uncovered the grim truth. May 10th, 1908.
The sheriff says Belle had a system. She placed ads promising love and happiness. These men came with their life savings, thinking they'd found a new beginning. She fed them, worked them, and then she killed them. They're finding watches, wedding rings. Anything that could identify them was stripped away.
The journal recounted the discoveries in shocking detail. Investigators unearthed body after body from Belle's farm. Some were buried in shallow graves, others hidden beneath layers of debris. The victims had been bludgeoned, poisoned, or suffocated, then dismembered. Among them was Andrew Helgelian, whose brother's persistence had exposed Belle's crimes. But he was just one of many. Ray Lamphere, Belle's farmhand, was arrested for arson after Belle's farmhouse burned to the ground. Inside the charred ruins, authorities found the bodies of Belle's 3 children and a headless woman. They assumed the woman was Belle, but doubt soon crept in. The headless body didn't match Belle's size. Her dental records didn't align. Witnesses claimed to have seen Belle boarding a train to Chicago the night before the fire, carrying a small black bag. June 2nd, 1908.
The talk won't die down about Belle possibly being alive. That headless body, some say it was too small to be her. And why would Ray burn the house with her children inside? He loved her. He wouldn't have hurt those kids.
During his trial, Ray confessed to helping Belle bury bodies. He said she had a plan to fake her death and escape, though no one could prove it. What became of Belle Gunness remains one of America's great mysteries. Some believe she fled to Norway. Others think she vanished into the crowds of Chicago, blending in with a new identity. But her farm remains a haunting reminder of the horrors she committed. Even now, over a century later, locals speak of strange lights moving across the fields at night. Travelers slow their cars as they pass, their imaginations running wild. June 10th, 1908.
I walked past the farm today. The ground is all torn up. 11 separate graves. The apple trees are blooming, the same trees they found bodies buried under. How many pies did she bake with those apples? Pies she served to her next victims.
Belle Gunness left behind a legacy of terror. As one of America's most prolific female serial killers, she claimed the lives of at least 14 people, though the true number may never be known. Whether she died in 1908 or escaped to start anew, one thing is certain: the beast of La Porte will never be forgotten. When I was a teenager, I remember hearing a haunting nursery rhyme. Lizzie Borden took an axe and gave her mother 40 whacks. When she saw what she had done, she gave her father 41. The rhyme was catchy, but I assumed it was just folklore. Then I started digging into the history and discovered it wasn't just a children's rhyme. It was based on a real murder case that shocked the nation. The story of Lizzie Borden is one of brutal violence, social scandal, and unanswered questions that still linger more than a century later. Tonight, I'll take you through the infamous case of Lizzie Borden, separating fact from fiction and exploring the dark secrets behind one of America's most enduring mysteries: the Borden family and their quiet life in Fall River. By 1892, Lizzie Borden was 32 years old and living in her family's home in Fall River, Massachusetts. She had never married, an unusual situation for a woman of her age and social standing at the time. Lizzie lived with her father, Andrew Borden, her stepmother, Abby Borden, and her older sister, Emma, who was often away visiting friends. The Bordens were wealthy, but their home was modest compared to the sprawling mansions of Fall River's elite. Andrew was notoriously frugal, refusing to upgrade the house with modern amenities like indoor plumbing, despite their financial means. Lizzie's relationship with her stepmother was strained at best. By all accounts, Lizzie despised Abby, whom she believed had married Andrew for his money. Tensions in the household were high, particularly over issues of inheritance. Andrew had recently given a property to Abby's relatives, a move that enraged both Lizzie and Emma. The two sisters felt their stepmother was gaining control over the family's wealth, and Lizzie's resentment toward Abby only deepened. The Borden family seemed outwardly respectable, but beneath the surface, their home was a pressure cooker ready to explode. The grisly murders on August 4th, 1892. The morning of August 4th, 1892, began like any other. Andrew Borden left the house to run errands in town, while Abby stayed home to manage the household. Bridget Sullivan, the family's maid, was tending to chores, despite feeling unwell in the sweltering summer heat. Lizzie claimed to have been in the barn behind the house, searching for fishing weights. By 9:30 a.m., the day took a horrific turn. Abby Borden was attacked in the upstairs guest bedroom, struck 19 times with a hatchet. The blows were so violent that her skull was shattered and her blood spattered across the walls and floor. An autopsy would later show that she had been facing her attacker when the first strike landed, but she fell to the floor, face down, as the remaining blows rained down on her. About an hour and a half later, Andrew Borden returned home. He sat down on the sofa in the parlor to rest. What happened next remains a mystery, but shortly after Andrew's return, he was struck 11 times with a hatchet. One of the blows split his eye socket in half, suggesting the attack was as sudden as it was brutal. His face was so mutilated that he was almost unrecognizable. At around 11:15 a.m., Lizzie called out to Bridget, claiming she had discovered her father's body. "Someone has killed Father," she reportedly cried. The scene was horrifying. Andrew's lifeless body lay slumped on the sofa, his face and head unrecognizable from the repeated strikes of the murder weapon. The investigation begins. Police arrived at the Borden home shortly after the murders were reported. They quickly found Abby's body upstairs, lying in a pool of blood. The brutality of the murders shocked even the most seasoned investigators. The house showed no signs of forced entry, and nothing appeared to have been stolen, ruling out robbery as a motive. Lizzie's behavior immediately raised suspicion. She claimed she had been in the barn during the time of the murders, but police found no evidence to support her story. Her dress appeared clean, with no visible bloodstains, though Bridget later testified that Lizzie had been wearing a different dress earlier in the morning. Witnesses also recalled Lizzie attempting to buy prussic acid, a highly toxic poison, just days before the murders, though the pharmacist had refused her request. Perhaps the most damning piece of evidence came when police discovered a hatchet in the basement of the Borden home. The blade was clean, but the handle had been broken off, leading investigators to believe it was the murder weapon. Despite this, no definitive proof tied the hatchet to the crime. Lizzie's behavior in the days following the murders did little to help her case. She seemed strangely composed and detached, even cold. During the inquest, her statements were inconsistent and at times bizarre. She denied hearing any sounds of a struggle and offered conflicting accounts of her whereabouts. Her calm demeanor and lack of emotion led many to suspect she was hiding something. The trial of the century. In June 1893, Lizzie Borden was charged with the murders of her father and stepmother. Her trial became a media sensation, drawing reporters and spectators from across the country. The case had everything: a wealthy family, a gruesome crime, and a female suspect who defied the expectations of her time. The prosecution argued that Lizzie had killed Abby out of hatred and Andrew to prevent him from discovering what she had done. They presented evidence of Lizzie's attempts to purchase poison, the suspicious hatchet found in the basement, and her inconsistent testimony. They also highlighted the family tensions and Lizzie's potential motive to gain control of her father's fortune. The defense, however, portrayed Lizzie as a gentle, devout woman incapable of such violence. They argued that no woman of her social standing could commit such a brutal crime, an idea that resonated with the all-male jury. The defense also questioned the reliability of the evidence, pointing out the lack of witnesses and the absence of blood on Lizzie's clothing. After just 90 minutes of deliberation, the jury acquitted Lizzie of all charges. The verdict shocked the nation. While some celebrated her innocence, others were convinced she had gotten away with murder. For the rest of her life, Lizzie remained a figure of controversy, with many believing she was guilty despite the jury's decision. Life after the trial. After her acquittal, Lizzie Borden returned to Fall River, but her life was far from normal. She and her sister, Emma, inherited their father's fortune, which allowed them to move into a large, modern home they called Maplecroft. But Lizzie's newfound wealth couldn't buy acceptance. She was shunned by the community, her name forever tied to the infamous murders. In 1905, Emma abruptly moved out of Maplecroft, reportedly after a disagreement with Lizzie. The two sisters never spoke again. Lizzie lived the rest of her life in relative isolation, her only companions being her staff and a few friends. She died of pneumonia in 1927 at the age of 66, still a pariah in her hometown. Separating fact from fiction. The story of Lizzie Borden has become a part of American folklore, but separating fact from fiction is no easy task. For example, the famous rhyme about Lizzie giving Abby 40 whacks is an exaggeration. Abby was struck 19 times, and Andrew 11. Similarly, the image of Lizzie as a cold-blooded killer with an axe in hand is based more on speculation than evidence. While Lizzie's guilt remains unproven, there are several theories about what really happened that day in August 1892. Some believe Lizzie killed her parents in a fit of rage over family tensions. Others suggest she may have had an accomplice, possibly Bridget Sullivan, who was unhappy with her treatment as the family's maid. There's even a theory that someone outside the household committed the murders, though this seems unlikely, given the lack of forced entry. One thing is certain: the mystery of Lizzie Borden continues to captivate and confound. The gruesome nature of the murders, combined with Lizzie's enigmatic personality and the societal expectations of her time, make her story one of the most enduring mysteries in American history, a legacy of infamy. More than 130 years later, the Borden home still stands in Fall River. It has been converted into a bed and breakfast and museum, drawing true crime enthusiasts and ghost hunters from around the world. Guests can stay in the rooms where Andrew and Abby were murdered, and some claim to have experienced paranormal activity. Lizzie Borden's story remains a cautionary tale, a chilling reminder of how wealth, resentment, and human nature can intersect with devastating consequences. Whether she was a cunning murderer or an innocent woman caught in a web of suspicion, Lizzie's name will forever be etched in history, and her story will continue to haunt those who dare to revisit it. While cleaning out my grandmother's old cedar chest in Los Angeles, I stumbled across a stack of brittle, yellowed newspaper clippings, each one tied to a name I'd vaguely heard whispered in family stories: Louise Pete. The headlines were like something out of a gothic thriller: Woman of Mystery Strikes Again, and The Lady Killer Faces Justice. I had no idea how deep this story would go until I started piecing together the fragments. Tonight, I'll share with you the chilling tale of Louise Pete, a woman who charmed her way into high society, betrayed everyone who trusted her, and left a trail of death and destruction. Louise Pete was born in 1880 in Bienville, Louisiana, into a respectable family. She grew up surrounded by wealth and privilege, with every opportunity to build a stable life. But Louise wasn't content to live within the boundaries of convention. From a young age, she exhibited a fascination with wealth and power, craving the kind of opulence that came with it. Her charm and beauty became her tools, and she wielded them with precision. Louise could manipulate anyone: men, women, and even entire communities. Her story truly began in 1920, when she arrived in Los Angeles. By then, she was already a widow under suspicious circumstances. Her first husband had reportedly died by suicide, but rumors circulated that Louise had driven him to it. Whether or not that was true, Louise had no trouble moving on. She had an uncanny ability to attract wealthy men and ingratiate herself into their lives. One of those men was Jacob Charles Denton, a mining engineer with a fortune to his name. Jacob Denton was a well-known figure in Los Angeles society, a man who seemed to have it all. But when he met Louise Pete, his fate was sealed. Louise presented herself as a sophisticated widow in need of a fresh start. She charmed Denton into renting her a room in his grand mansion on Wilshire Boulevard, and within weeks, she had insinuated herself into every aspect of his life. In May 1920, Jacob Denton mysteriously disappeared. When neighbors and friends inquired about his whereabouts, Louise had an answer ready. She claimed that Denton had been injured in a bizarre fight with a Spanish woman who had attacked him with a sword, leaving him disfigured and embarrassed to be seen. She explained that he had gone into hiding to recover. Her story was strange, but Louise was so confident, so composed, that no one pressed further. In the meantime, she continued living in Denton's mansion, selling off his belongings and forging his checks. Months later, When Denton's friends demanded an investigation, police searched the house and discovered his decomposed body buried in a basement storage room. He had been shot in the back of the head, execution style. Louise, of course, was nowhere to be found. By the time authorities caught up with her, she was in Colorado, trying to charm her way into another wealthy man's life. She was extradited to California and charged with murder. The trial was a media sensation. Louise Pete presented herself as the picture of calm innocence. She insisted she had no knowledge of Denton's murder and claimed that she had left his home because of her grief over his sudden disappearance. But the evidence against her was damning. Denton's forged checks, the stolen valuables, the lies about his whereabouts, everything pointed to Louise as the culprit. The jury saw through her facade, and in 1921, she was convicted of first-degree murder and sentenced to life in prison. For most people, this is where the story would end. But Louise Pete wasn't like most people. After serving 18 years behind bars, Louise was granted parole in 1939. At this point, she was a 59-year-old woman with a notorious past, but her charm hadn't diminished. She moved to Pacific Palisades, where she found a job as a live-in housekeeper for a wealthy widow named Margaret Logan. Margaret was a kind, trusting woman who believed in giving people second chances. She welcomed Louise into her home and treated her like family. But Louise had no intention of starting fresh. Old habits die hard, and Louise quickly began scheming. She convinced Margaret to sign over control of her finances, promising to manage her money and property. Before long, Louise was forging Margaret's signature on checks, draining her bank accounts, and living off her wealth. Just as with Jacob Denton, Louise's greed soon turned deadly. In 1944, Margaret Logan disappeared under suspicious circumstances. When neighbors asked about her absence, Louise claimed that Margaret had gone to Arizona for health reasons. But Margaret's friends grew concerned when they stopped receiving letters from her. Suspicion mounted, and police began investigating. What they found was disturbingly familiar. Margaret Logan's body was discovered buried in the backyard of her own home. Like Denton, she had been shot in the head. The trail of evidence led straight to Louise Pete, who had been living in Margaret's house and using her money in the weeks after her disappearance. Louise was arrested once again, and this time, her crime shocked even the most hardened investigators. The trial that followed was another media frenzy. Reporters flocked to the courthouse, eager to cover the story of the elderly woman who had become a two-time killer. Louise, now in her 60s, tried to use her age and frailty to gain sympathy. But her cold, calculated actions spoke louder than her words. Witnesses testified about her manipulative behavior, and the evidence against her was overwhelming. In 1945, Louise Pete was convicted of murder for the second time and sentenced to death. Louise spent her final years on death row at San Quentin State Prison. Even in prison, she maintained her composure, never admitting guilt and showing no remorse for her actions. On April 11th, 1947, Louise Pete was executed in California's gas chamber. She was the first woman to be executed in the state since 1893, and her death marked the end of one of the most infamous crime sprees in California history. But even in death, Louise Pete left behind unanswered questions. How many other victims might she have claimed before Jacob Denton? How many lives did she destroy with her greed and deception? Some estimates suggests she may have killed as many as 4 or 5 additional victims, but those crimes were never proven. What makes Louise Pete's story so chilling is her ability to manipulate those around her. She wasn't violent or erratic. She was calculated, patient, and methodical. She used charm and intelligence to gain the trust of her victims, only to betray them in the most brutal way possible. Her crimes weren't crimes of passion. They were premeditated acts of greed, carried out with chilling precision. As I put the clippings and notes back into the cedar chest, I couldn't stop thinking about the lives Louise Pete destroyed. She wasn't just a murderer. She was a predator who thrived on trust and generosity. Her story is a stark reminder that appearances can be deceiving, and that the most dangerous people often hide in plain sight. Even today, the name Louise Pete serves as a cautionary tale, a reminder of how far someone will go for money and power. For the victims she left behind, and for the communities she deceived, her legacy remains one of betrayal and loss. While cleaning out my uncle's storage unit in Fayetteville, North Carolina, I found a tattered box with police files and court transcripts from 1978. I didn't think much of it at first. Just another collection of old papers from his days as a journalist. But as I sifted through the documents, I came across a name I had only heard in whispers growing up: Velma Barfield. My uncle had covered her trial, and the details he collected painted a picture darker than I ever imagined. Tonight, I'll share with you the chilling story of the woman who became known as the Death Row Granny. Velma Barfield grew up in rural South Carolina, the daughter of a strict and often abusive father. Born in 1932, she lived a quiet life in her early years. She married young and had 2 children. But tragedy seemed to follow her. Her first husband died in a mysterious house fire, and her second husband also met an untimely death. Both were ruled accidents at the time. But as I read deeper into the files, the truth behind her life began to emerge. By the 1970s, Velma had developed an addiction to prescription drugs. The calm, devout Christian woman her neighbors thought they knew was beginning to spiral. She found herself in financial trouble, often forging checks and stealing money to support her addiction. But it was her method of solving these problems that would later shock the nation. The first victim was her own mother, Lillian Bullard. According to witness testimony, Lillian fell ill suddenly, complaining of severe nausea, stomach pain, and weakness. Velma played the role of the devoted daughter, nursing her mother back to health, or so it seemed. But when Lillian died unexpectedly, no one suspected Velma. It was written off as natural causes, a tragic loss for a grieving daughter. Velma's next victim was her boyfriend, Stuart Taylor. Stuart was a quiet man, kind-hearted and trusting. Velma had been forging checks in his name, and when he began to notice discrepancies in his finances, she panicked. To keep him from uncovering the truth, Velma laced his food with arsenic. Over time, Stuart grew sicker and sicker. He complained of excruciating pain, his body wasting away. Velma stayed by his side, feigning concern, all while administering doses of poison in his meals. Stuart's death, however, would be the turning point. Unlike her previous victims, Stuart's family pressed for an investigation. An autopsy revealed lethal levels of arsenic in his system. Suspicion fell on Velma, and when police dug deeper into her past, they uncovered a chilling pattern. Velma Barfield had left a trail of bodies, and now The walls were closing in. The files I found included chilling interviews with Velma. She admitted to poisoning 6 people, including her own mother, Stuart, and 3 elderly patients she had cared for as a home nurse. Her confession was both shocking and cold. Velma claimed she never intended to kill anyone. According to her, she only wanted to make her victims sick enough to avoid their suspicions about her financial crimes. But the evidence told a different story. Autopsy reports described the horrifying effects of arsenic poisoning. Victims suffered agonizing pain as the poison attacked their internal organs. Their deaths were slow and excruciating, often taking days or even weeks. Velma, meanwhile, maintained a facade of care and concern, all while ensuring no one would connect her to their suffering. In 1978, Velma was arrested and charged with multiple counts of murder. Her trial captivated the nation, especially when her calm demeanor in the courtroom contrasted sharply with the gruesome details of her crimes. Witnesses testified about Velma's kindness and devotion to her church, but others painted a darker picture. Prosecutors described a manipulative woman who preyed on the trust of her victims, using her position as a caregiver to gain access to their lives, and ultimately to their deaths. The files included court transcripts that detailed Velma's defense. She blamed her actions on her addiction to prescription drugs, claiming they clouded her judgment and drove her to desperation. She insisted she never meant to kill anyone, but the jury didn't buy it. The meticulous planning, the consistent use of arsenic, and the sheer number of victims painted a picture of someone who knew exactly what she was doing. In November 1978, Velma Barfield was convicted of first-degree murder for the poisoning of Stuart Taylor. She was sentenced to death, becoming the first woman in the United States to be executed by lethal injection. As I read through my uncle's notes, I found a chilling detail about Velma's time on death row. She reportedly underwent a religious transformation, becoming a born-again Christian and even counseling other inmates. She wrote letters to the families of her victims, asking for forgiveness. Some accepted her apology, while others saw it as a hollow gesture from a woman who had caused so much pain. On November 2, 1984, Velma Barfield was executed at Central Prison in Raleigh, North Carolina. Witnesses described the scene as eerily quiet. Velma declined a last meal and chose instead to pray with a minister. Her final words were, "I want to say that I'm sorry for all the hurt I've caused." Her execution marked a grim milestone in American history. Velma Barfield was the first woman in the U.S. to be executed by lethal injection, a method that was seen at the time as more humane than the electric chair. But for the families of her victims, her death brought little closure. The scars left by her actions would remain for generations. As I closed the box of files, I couldn't shake the image of Velma Barfield, the sweet, grandmotherly woman who used arsenic as her weapon of choice. She didn't fit the typical profile of a serial killer. There was no bloodlust, no thrill-seeking. Instead, her crimes were driven by greed, desperation, and a willingness to exploit the trust of those closest to her. Velma's story is a chilling reminder that evil doesn't always wear a monstrous face. Sometimes, it looks like the person who sits beside you in church, the neighbor who offers you a kind word, or even the grandmother baking cookies in her kitchen. In the end, it wasn't her addiction or her circumstances that defined her. It was her choices. The files I found in that storage unit have stayed with me, They tell a story not just of Velma Barfield, but of the lives she destroyed and the pain she left behind. Fayetteville may be a quiet town today, but the shadow of Velma's crimes lingers, a reminder that darkness can hide in the most unexpected places. While cleaning out my grandfather's office in Pensacola, Florida, I stumbled upon a box of old crime magazines and handwritten notes. At first, I assumed they were part of his hobby. He'd always been fascinated by true crime. But as I looked closer, I found newspaper clippings and trial transcripts about one of Florida's most infamous killers, a woman whose story I'd only heard in whispers. Her name was Judy Buenoano, but she became known as the Black Widow of the South. What I uncovered about her life and crimes was more shocking than I could have imagined. Tonight, I'll take you through the story of a woman who left a trail of destruction in her wake. Judy Buenoano was born in 1943 in Quanah, Texas. Her early life was difficult. Her mother died when she was a toddler, and she and her siblings were sent to live with various relatives. Judy would later claim that her childhood was filled with abuse and neglect, a background often cited in discussions of her later crimes. But whether or not her upbringing shaped her actions, it's clear that Judy Buenoano made choices that would devastate the lives of those closest to her. In 1962, Judy married her first husband, James Goodyear, a respected Air Force sergeant. To the outside world, they seemed like a normal, happy family. The couple settled in Orlando, Florida, and had a son, Michael, along with 2 other children. But in 1971, just a few months after James returned from serving in Vietnam, he fell mysteriously ill. He suffered from debilitating stomach pain, nausea, and weakness. Doctors were baffled, and after weeks of suffering, James died. His death was ruled natural causes, later suspected to be complications from Agent Orange exposure during the war. But as I read the transcripts in my grandfather's box, I saw the truth. Judy had poisoned James with arsenic. She collected a substantial life insurance payout after his death, money she used to support her children and enhance her lifestyle. No one suspected the grieving widow of foul play at the time, but her husband's death was only the beginning. In the years that followed, Judy's son, Michael, became the next target of her sinister plans. By the late 1970s, Michael had grown into a young man with a promising future. But after a mysterious illness, he was left partially paralyzed and had to use braces to walk. Judy claimed it was the result of a motorcycle accident, but there were whispers among relatives that something didn't add up. In 1980, Judy took Michael on a canoeing trip in the Florida Panhandle. What happened next was both horrifying and tragic. The canoe capsized in the water, and Michael, weighed down by his leg braces, drowned. Judy, however, survived. Authorities initially believed it was a tragic accident, but behind the scenes, investigators began to notice a pattern. Every tragedy in Judy's life seemed to result in a hefty insurance payout. Michael's death was no exception. Judy collected $20,000 in life insurance, money she'd taken out on him just months before his death. If Michael's drowning was the most shocking, it was far from her only crime. By this point, Judy was living with a new boyfriend, Bobby Joe Morris, in Colorado. In 1978, Bobby Joe also fell mysteriously ill, suffering from symptoms similar to those of her first husband. Within weeks, Bobby Joe was dead. Again, no one suspected Judy at first, and she walked away with another insurance payout. It wasn't until years later, when Bobby Joe's body was exhumed, that investigators confirmed he had been poisoned with arsenic. What struck me as I read through the files was how calculated Judy's actions were. She didn't act out of rage or passion. Instead, she used poison, a method that requires time, patience, and careful planning. And each time, her goal was the same: money. She preyed on the people who trusted her the most, all for financial gain. Judy's crimes didn't stop with Bobby Joe. In 1983, she became engaged to John Gentry, a successful businessman in Pensacola. But John began noticing strange things about Judy. She encouraged him to take vitamins that she prepared for him, which made him feel sick. He started to grow suspicious, and his fears were confirmed when his car exploded one day in a parking lot. John survived the blast and told authorities that Judy had been acting strangely in the weeks leading up to the incident. An investigation revealed that she had rigged the car with a bomb in an attempt to kill him. It was John's survival that finally brought Judy's crimes to light. Police began to dig into her past, uncovering a disturbing trail of dead husbands, boyfriends, and even her own son. The evidence was overwhelming. Toxicology reports confirmed arsenic poisoning in multiple victims, and investigators discovered that Judy had taken out life insurance policies on nearly everyone who had died under her care. Her method was always the same. She gained her victims' trust, poisoned them slowly, and profited from their deaths. In 1984, Judy Buenoano was arrested and charged with multiple counts of murder, attempted murder, and insurance fraud. Her trial was a media sensation. The public was captivated by the story of a woman who looked like an ordinary middle-aged grandmother, but had committed such heinous crimes. In court, prosecutors described her as a cold, calculating killer who used charm and deception to get what she wanted. Judy, for her part, showed little emotion during the trial, maintaining her innocence and blaming the deaths on bad luck or other circumstances. The jury didn't believe her. Judy was convicted of multiple murders and sentenced to death. She spent over a decade on death row, appealing her conviction and maintaining her innocence. But in 1998, her time ran out. On March 30th of that year, Judy Buenoano became the first woman in Florida to be executed in the electric chair since 1848. Her execution marked the end of one of Florida's most infamous murder cases. But even after her death, questions lingered about how many lives she had truly taken. Some estimates suggest she may have killed as many as 10 people, though only 3 murders were confirmed in court. What is certain is that Judy's crimes left a trail of devastation that extended far beyond her immediate victims. Families were shattered, lives were ruined, and the small towns she lived in would never forget the shadow she cast. As I put the files back into the box, I couldn't stop thinking about the duality of Judy Buenoano's life. To the outside world, she was a caring mother, a loving partner, and a hard-working woman. But behind closed doors, she was the Black Widow of the South, a woman who saw the people in her life not as loved ones, but as opportunities. Her story is a chilling reminder of how appearances can be deceiving, and how evil can hide in plain sight. The name Judy Buenoano may not be as well known as other serial killers, but her crimes remain some of the most shocking in American history. Her life serves as a dark chapter in the history of Florida, a story of greed, betrayal, and murder that will never be forgotten. few years ago, while browsing through a used bookstore in New York, I came across an old, faded box labeled True Crime Archives. Inside were crumbling newspaper clippings, handwritten notes, and photographs from the 1940s. One name kept appearing over and over again: Martha Beck. As I sifted through the materials, I realized I had stumbled onto the twisted story of one of America's most infamous criminal duos, Martha Beck and Raymond Fernandez, better known as the Lonely Hearts Killers. What I found told a chilling story of betrayal, manipulation, and cold-blooded murder. Tonight, I'll take you through their crimes and the tragic path that led Martha Beck to the electric chair at Sing Sing. Martha Beck was born in Milton, Florida in 1920. Her early life was anything but easy. She grew up in poverty, facing ridicule from her peers because of her weight and awkward demeanor. Martha endured physical and emotional abuse from her family, and as she grew older, the scars from her upbringing shaped her personality. Despite her intelligence, she was reportedly an excellent student. Martha's self-esteem was shattered, and she became desperate for love and acceptance. In her early 20s, Martha trained as a nurse and eventually found work at a hospital. Her colleagues described her as competent but moody. During World War II, she briefly married a man, but the relationship ended as quickly as it began, leaving her a single mother of 2 children. By the late 1940s, Martha was living a lonely, difficult life, yearning for romance and stability. Her life took a dark turn when she answered a personal ad placed by Raymond Fernandez in 1947. Raymond Fernandez was a smooth-talking con man who preyed on lonely women. Born in Hawaii in 1914, Fernandez had a troubled past of his own. A head injury during his time as a merchant marine reportedly altered his personality, leaving him manipulative and devoid of empathy. After serving time in prison for theft, Fernandez developed a scheme to defraud women by placing personal ads in Lonely Hearts columns, claiming to be a charming widower looking for love. He would gain their trust, steal their money, and vanish without a trace. When Martha met Fernandez, she was immediately smitten. His charm and confidence filled the emotional void in her life, and she quickly fell under his spell. Fernandez, in turn, realized that Martha's devotion could be useful. Rather than scam her like the others, he made her his partner in crime. Martha abandoned her children and moved to New York to be with Fernandez. To avoid suspicion, the pair concocted a cover story. Martha would pose as Fernandez's sister. Together, they began targeting lonely, vulnerable women through personal ads. At first, Martha played a supporting role, helping Fernandez establish trust with his victims. But as time went on, her involvement escalated. What began as a scheme to steal money soon turned into something far more sinister. Their first known victim was Janet Fay, a 66-year-old widow from Albany, New York. Fernandez met Janet through a personal ad and quickly charmed her into agreeing to marry him. In January 1949, Janet moved in with Fernandez and Martha, believing she was starting a new life with her loving fiancé. But when Janet grew suspicious of Fernandez's intentions, things took a dark turn. During an argument, Martha flew into a rage and struck Janet in the head with a hammer. Fernandez finished the job by strangling her with a scarf. They buried Janet's body in a makeshift grave and continued their scheme, unfazed by the horror of what they had done. Their next victims were Delphine Downing and her 2-year-old daughter, Raynell. Delphine, a young widow from Michigan, responded to Fernandez's ad and invited the pair into her home. She quickly became suspicious of their behavior, particularly Martha's jealousy and controlling nature. When Delphine expressed doubts about Fernandez's intentions, Martha gave her sleeping pills to calm her down. But when Raynell began crying for her mother, Martha panicked. She strangled the child in a fit of rage, smothering her with a pillow. Fernandez then shot Delphine in the head, killing her while she was still unconscious. They buried both bodies in the basement of Delphine's home. The murders of Delphine and Raynell were particularly horrifying. This wasn't just about money anymore. This was about control and power. Martha, who had once seemed like a desperate woman longing for love, was now a full participant in Fernandez's killing spree. Her willingness to kill, even a child, showed how far she had fallen under his influence. Despite their efforts to cover their tracks, Fernandez and Martha's crimes began to catch up with them. In March 1949, neighbors of Delphine Downing grew suspicious of her sudden disappearance and alerted the police. When officers arrived at her home, they discovered the graves in the basement and immediately arrested Fernandez and Martha. During their interrogation, Fernandez confessed to the murders in shocking detail, and Martha, ever loyal to him, followed suit. Their trial in New York was a media circus. Reporters couldn't get enough of the bizarre, almost theatrical relationship between Martha and Fernandez. Martha's jealousy, Fernandez's arrogance, and their gruesome crimes captivated the public. Prosecutors argued that the pair had no regard for human life, targeting vulnerable women and using Martha's role as Fernandez's sister to gain their victims' trust. The evidence against them was overwhelming, and their own confessions sealed their fate. Throughout the trial, Martha displayed an unsettling devotion to Fernandez. She claimed she would have done anything for him, even kill. "I loved him more than I loved my own children," she reportedly said. This twisted loyalty became a central theme of their story. Martha's willingness to abandon her morality, her family, and her humanity for a man who saw her as nothing more than a tool. In 1951, both Martha Beck and Raymond Fernandez were convicted of murder and sentenced to death. They were executed side by side in the electric chair at Sing Sing Prison on March 8, 1951. Martha's final words were haunting. "What does it matter who is to blame? My story is a love story, but only those tortured with love can understand what I mean." The case of the Lonely Hearts Killers remains one of the most infamous in American history, not just for the brutality of the murders, but for the psychological dynamics between Fernandez and Martha. Their crimes were calculated and predatory, targeting women who were already vulnerable and seeking companionship. But what makes their story so chilling is the way their twisted relationship fueled their crimes. Martha, a woman who once seemed like a victim of circumstance, became a willing accomplice in Fernandez's schemes, driven by a desperate need for his approval. The evidence suggests that Fernandez and Martha may have killed as many as 20 women, though only a handful of murders were ever confirmed. Their victims were often middle-aged or elderly widows, women who had already endured loss and heartbreak. Fernandez used their loneliness against them, promising love and security while plotting their deaths. And with Martha by his side, he was able to escalate his crimes in ways he likely never could have alone. As I left the bookstore with the box of archives, I couldn't shake the feeling that Martha Beck's story was a cautionary tale. She wasn't a monster in the traditional sense. She was a woman whose longing for love and acceptance led her down a path of unimaginable darkness. But that doesn't absolve her of her crimes. She made a choice, again and again, to put her loyalty to Fernandez above the lives of their victims. The story of Martha Beck and Raymond Fernandez is a reminder that evil doesn't always appear as a lone predator. Sometimes it's a partnership, a shared hunger for power, control, or love that destroys everything in its path. For the women who fell victim to the Lonely Hearts Killers, and for the child who never had a chance to grow up, their story serves as a chilling warning about the dangers of misplaced trust. Even today, the names Martha Beck and Raymond Fernandez send shivers down the spines of those who hear them. A legacy of betrayal and blood that will never be forgotten. When I was younger, I remember watching the 1967 movie Bonnie and Clyde for the first time. Like so many others, I was captivated by the glamorized portrayal of this infamous duo. Two star-crossed outlaws, hopelessly in love, rebelling against authority during the Great Depression. But as I grew older and began delving into true crime stories, I realized the truth about Bonnie Parker and Clyde Barrow was far darker than Hollywood's romanticized depiction. What I discovered was a tale of desperation, violence, and betrayal. Tonight, I'll help separate fact from fiction and explore the real story of Bonnie Parker, one half of America's most notorious criminal duo. Early life of Bonnie Parker. Bonnie Parker was born on October 1st, 1910, in Rowena, Texas. Her early life was far from glamorous. When Bonnie was just 4 years old, her father passed away, leaving her mother to raise 3 children alone. The family struggled financially, eventually moving to a working-class neighborhood in Dallas. Despite their hardships, Bonnie excelled in school and showed a creative side, writing poetry and dreaming of a life beyond the dusty streets of West Dallas. By her late teens, Bonnie had married her high school sweetheart, Roy Thornton, but the marriage quickly soured as Roy's criminal tendencies emerged. By 1929, Bonnie was living on her own, working as a waitress and writing in her diary about her longing for excitement and love. It was during this time that fate introduced her to Clyde Barrow, a meeting that would change her life forever. Clyde Barrow, the charismatic criminal. Clyde Barrow came from a similarly difficult background. Born in 1909 in Tellico, Texas, he grew up in poverty, and his family worked as tenant farmers. Clyde's first brush with crime came as a teenager when he began stealing cars and robbing small businesses. By the time he met Bonnie in 1930, Clyde was already a wanted man, having been arrested multiple times for theft and burglary. The attraction between Bonnie and Clyde was immediate. According to those who knew them, Bonnie saw Clyde as a way out of her dull life, a ticket to the excitement she craved. Clyde, in turn, was drawn to Bonnie's wit and loyalty. Together, they formed a bond that would drive them to infamy. The Bonnie and Clyde gang. The early 1930s was a time of widespread poverty and unrest in America. The Great Depression had left millions struggling to survive, and stories of outlaws like Bonnie and Clyde captured the public's imagination. They were seen as modern-day Robin Hoods, defying corrupt banks and law enforcement. But the reality was far less romantic. The Barrow Gang, as they became known, was a loose collection of criminals that revolved around Bonnie and Clyde. Members came and went, but the core was always the two of them. Throughout their 2-year crime spree, the gang committed a string of robberies across Texas, Oklahoma, Missouri, and Louisiana, targeting banks, stores, and gas stations. What set Bonnie and Clyde apart from other criminals of the time was their willingness to use violence. While Bonnie's role in the killings has been debated, Clyde was undoubtedly the triggerman in most cases. By the end of their spree, the gang was responsible for the deaths of at least 13 people, including 9 law enforcement officers. Their crimes weren't acts of rebellion. They were calculated and ruthless. Separating fact from fiction, Hollywood and the media have played a significant role in shaping the myth of Bonnie and Clyde. One of the most enduring images of Bonnie is a photograph of her with a cigar in her mouth, holding a shotgun. The picture, taken during a playful moment, was found by police after a raid on one of the gang's hideouts. It was published in newspapers across the country, transforming Bonnie into a larger-than-life outlaw queen. But the truth about Bonnie Parker is far more complex. Evidence suggests she was more of an accomplice than an active participant in the gang's killings. Clyde was the driving force behind their violence, while Bonnie often served as the lookout or getaway driver. Her diary, found after her death, paints a picture of a woman torn between love and regret. One entry reads, "I'm Miss Bonnie Parker. I'm a gangster too. I carry a gun just like my man Clyde do." Though she carried a gun and was present during the gang's crimes, there's little evidence that Bonnie ever killed anyone. Instead, she seemed to play the role of Clyde's loyal partner, willing to follow him wherever he went, even if it meant leaving behind a trail of blood. The violent end. By 1934, Bonnie and Clyde's luck was running out. Their gang had been severely weakened, with several members either dead or captured. The couple was constantly on the move, living out of stolen cars and hiding in remote locations. They were wanted in multiple states, and law enforcement was closing in. The end came on May 23, 1934, in Bienville Parish, Louisiana. Acting on a tip, a posse of 6 lawmen set up an ambush along a rural road. Clyde was driving a stolen Ford V8 with Bonnie in the passenger seat. As they approached, the officers opened fire without warning, unloading over 130 rounds into the vehicle. Clyde died instantly from a headshot, and Bonnie, clutching a sandwich, was killed moments later. The couple never had a chance to return fire. The aftermath of their deaths was chaotic. Throngs of people descended on the crime scene, eager to get a glimpse of the infamous duo. Some even tried to cut off pieces of Bonnie's hair or take fragments of the bullet-riddled car as souvenirs. The bodies of Bonnie and Clyde were taken back to Dallas, where they were buried in separate cemeteries at the request of their families. The legacy of Bonnie Parker. Despite her violent end, Bonnie Parker's story continues to fascinate people. Was she a cold-blooded criminal, or a victim of circumstance swept up in Clyde's destructive path? The truth likely lies somewhere in between. Bonnie was undeniably complicit in the gang's crimes, but her motivations were complex. She wasn't driven by greed or a desire for power. She was driven by love, loyalty, and a yearning for escape. The romanticized image of Bonnie and Clyde as tragic lovers has persisted for decades, but it's important to remember the real consequences of their actions. Their victims weren't nameless figures. They were people with families and lives cut short by the couple's reckless pursuit of infamy. As I left the bookstore with the box of archives, I couldn't help but think about how easily the lines between fact and fiction can blur. Bonnie Parker wasn't the cigar-smoking outlaw queen of Hollywood lore, but neither was she an innocent bystander. Her story is a cautionary tale about the dangers of unquestioning loyalty and the seductive power of crime. For all the glamour and intrigue surrounding her name, the reality is far darker and far more human. Scrolling through an article about women on death row, I came across the name Blanche Taylor Moore. She's a name I hadn't heard before, yet her story was as chilling as any in true crime history. Known as the Black Widow of North Carolina, Blanche poisoned those closest to her over decades, using arsenic to slowly destroy the lives of the people who trusted her most. What makes her case even more unsettling is that, as I write this in January 2025, Blanche Taylor Moore is still alive today, sitting on North Carolina's death row as its oldest female inmate. Tonight, I'll take you through the story of a woman who left a trail of death and betrayal across 2 decades, and how she almost got away with it. Blanche's early life. Blanche Kaiser was born in 1933 in Concord, North Carolina, and raised in a strict religious household. Her father, Parker Kaiser, was a mill worker and Baptist preacher, but he was also an alcoholic who subjected his family to abuse. Blanche grew up surrounded by hardship, and her father's cruelty left lasting scars on her psyche. Despite these difficulties, Blanche appeared to lead a normal life. She attended church regularly and eventually married James Taylor, a man she described as kind and hardworking. For many years, Blanche lived what seemed to be an ordinary life in Burlington, North Carolina. She worked at Kroger, a local grocery store, and was known as a friendly and outgoing employee. But underneath her warm and sociable demeanor, Blanche harbored a dark side, one that would later make her infamous: the start of the killings. Blanche's first marriage to James Taylor seemed stable on the surface, but their relationship was far from perfect. In 1973, James fell mysteriously ill, complaining of severe stomach pain, vomiting, and weakness. Doctors were baffled by his symptoms, which worsened over several months until James finally died in October of that year. His death was attributed to a heart attack, but in hindsight, it bore all the hallmarks of arsenic poisoning. At the time, no one suspected Blanche of wrongdoing. She perfectly played the role of the grieving widow, leaning on her community and her faith to endure the loss. But James Taylor's death was only the beginning, a pattern of death. Over the next 2 decades, those closest to Blanche began dropping like flies. Her father, Parker Kaiser, died in 1966, reportedly after ingesting a bowl of stewed prunes Blanche had prepared for him. While his death was initially chalked up to old age, it was later suspected that Blanche had poisoned him to escape his abusive behavior. Blanche's mother-in-law, Isla Taylor, also died under mysterious circumstances after suffering from symptoms consistent with arsenic poisoning. Again, Blanche's involvement went unnoticed, as the deaths were attributed to natural causes. The pattern continued with several boyfriends, all of whom developed unexplained illnesses after getting involved with her. Blanche's next long-term partner, Raymond Reed, worked with her at Kroger. Their relationship seemed happy at first, but Reed soon began complaining of stomach pain, fatigue, and other symptoms. Unbeknownst to him, Blanche had been lacing his food with arsenic, slowly poisoning him over time. By 1986, His health had deteriorated so badly that he was hospitalized. Despite receiving treatment, Reed died after a prolonged illness. Even at this point, Blanche managed to avoid suspicion. Her calm demeanor and religious devotion made it difficult for anyone to believe she was capable of such heinous acts. She attended church regularly, quoted scripture, and presented herself as a caring, loving partner. But beneath the surface, Blanche was a cold and calculating killer. The investigation begins. Blanche might have continued her killing spree indefinitely, if not for the death of another romantic partner, Reverend Dwight Moore, who narrowly survived her attempts to poison him. The two had begun dating in the late 1980s, and Blanche once again portrayed herself as a devout and supportive companion. But shortly after their relationship became serious, Moore started to experience severe gastrointestinal symptoms. Unlike her previous victims, Moore survived long enough for doctors to notice something unusual. Lab tests revealed alarmingly high levels of arsenic in his system, so high that it was clear the poisoning was intentional. Moore's doctors alerted authorities, and an investigation into Blanche's past began. What they uncovered was shocking. Exhumations of her previous victims, including Raymond Reed and James Taylor, revealed traces of arsenic in their remains. Blanche's seemingly tragic life as a widow and devoted partner was exposed as a web of lies, with her using poison to eliminate those who became inconvenient or stood in the way of her financial gain. The trial and conviction. Blanche Taylor Moore was arrested in 1989 and charged with first-degree murder for the death of Raymond Reed. The trial began in 1990 and quickly became one of the most sensational cases in North Carolina history. The media dubbed her the Black Widow, and the public was captivated by the contrast between her sweet, grandmotherly appearance and the heinous crimes she was accused of committing. Prosecutors argued that Blanche's motive was simple: greed. She poisoned her victims to gain access to their life insurance policies, pensions, and savings. Witnesses testified about her suspicious behavior, including her habit of preparing meals and drinks for her victims shortly before they fell ill. Toxicology reports provided damning evidence, confirming lethal levels of arsenic in the bodies of her former husbands and boyfriends. Throughout the trial, Blanche maintained her innocence, insisting that she had no idea how arsenic had entered her victims' systems. Her defense team argued that the evidence was circumstantial and that there was no direct proof linking Blanche to the poisonings. But the jury was unconvinced. In November 1990, Blanche Taylor Moore was convicted of first-degree murder for the death of Raymond Reed and sentenced to death. She remains on North Carolina's death row to this day, the oldest woman to await execution in the state. Similarities to other Black widows. Blanche's methods were strikingly similar to those of Velma Barfield, another North Carolina woman who used arsenic to kill multiple victims in the 1970s. Both women targeted vulnerable individuals, husbands, boyfriends, and elderly relatives, and exploited their trust to carry out their crimes. However, unlike Barfield, who confessed to her murders and expressed remorse, Blanche has never admitted guilt, maintaining her innocence despite overwhelming evidence to the contrary. Life on death row. Blanche's time on death row has been relatively uneventful. Now in her late 80s, she lives in the North Carolina Correctional Institution for Women, where she spends her days reading, writing letters, and attending religious services. Her execution has been repeatedly delayed due to legal appeals and changes in the state's death penalty procedures. As of now, it remains unclear if Blanche will ever face execution or if she will die of natural causes in prison. Legacy of the Black Widow. Blanche Taylor. Moore's case serves as a chilling reminder of how evil can hide behind the most unassuming facades. She wasn't a masked intruder or a shadowy figure lurking in the night. She was a church-going woman with a warm smile, a friendly co-worker who brought baked goods to potlucks. But beneath her kind exterior was a manipulative killer who preyed on the people who trusted her most. Her story also highlights the dangers of misplaced trust and the importance of recognizing patterns in unexplained deaths. If not for the persistence of doctors and investigators, Blanche might have continued her deadly streak, claiming more lives in the process. Final thoughts. The case of Blanche Taylor Moore is as unsettling as it is fascinating. Her ability to charm those around her while committing such calculated and methodical murders speaks to the darkest corners of human nature. Even now, decades after her conviction, her story continues to captivate and horrify those who hear it. Blanche's name may not be as widely known as other serial killers, but her crimes stand as a testament to the idea that appearances can be deceiving, and that the most dangerous predators often hide in plain sight. A few months ago, I was scrolling through social media when I stumbled upon a true crime discussion about a seemingly sweet elderly woman who turned out to be one of America's most cold-blooded killers. The headline read, "Dorothea Puente, the Death House Landlady." Her story immediately grabbed my attention, and I started digging. What I found was chilling. A woman who preyed on society's most vulnerable, turning her Sacramento boarding house into a house of horrors. Tonight, I'll take you through the story of Dorothea Puente, a killer who hid her evil behind grandmotherly charm. Dorothea's early life. Dorothea Helen Gray was born in Redlands, California, in 1929, during the height of the Great Depression. Her childhood was anything but idyllic. Both of her parents died when she was still young, leaving her to grow up in an orphanage and foster homes. It was a difficult start to life, but Dorothea wasn't one to let hardship hold her back. By her early 20s, she was married, living in California, and had started carving out a life for herself. However, Dorothea's early adult years were marked by instability. She married multiple times, held various jobs, and even served jail time for forging checks. By the 1960s, she had established herself as a small-time grifter, running scams and working as a caregiver to the elderly. A job that would later give her the skills she needed to carry out her deadly scheme. The boarding house operation. By the 1980s, Dorothea had settled in Sacramento, where she operated a boarding house at 1426 F Street. The property was a modest two-story Victorian home in a quiet neighborhood. To her neighbors, Dorothea was the perfect landlady, kind, soft-spoken, and always willing to help those in need. She specifically opened her doors to the elderly, mentally disabled, and homeless individuals, people who had nowhere else to turn. Her tenants were a vulnerable group, often dependent on Social Security checks to survive. Dorothea presented herself as a benevolent caregiver, helping her tenants with meals, clothing, and medical appointments. She even volunteered at local charities, further cementing her image as a generous and kind-hearted woman. But behind closed doors, Dorothea was anything but kind. She had a dark plan to exploit her tenants for financial gain. The murders begin. Dorothea's scheme was as calculated as it was cruel. She targeted tenants who had little family involvement or whose disappearances wouldn't raise immediate alarm. Once they moved in, she would take control of their finances, cashing their Social Security checks and keeping the money for herself. To cover her tracks, she continued to pay rent and small expenses for her victims, making it appear as though they were still alive. When a tenant became inconvenient, either by asking too many questions or by threatening to leave, Dorothea took drastic action. Using sedatives and overdoses, she would incapacitate her victims before killing them. The most horrifying part? Dorothea didn't dispose of the bodies in a remote location or attempt to hide them in the woods. Instead, she buried them in the backyard of her boarding house, planting shrubs and flowers to conceal the shallow graves. The Garden of Death. For years, Dorothea got away with her crimes. She would tell concerned social workers and neighbors that her missing tenants had moved away or gone to live with family. Her calm demeanor and grandmotherly appearance made it difficult for anyone to question her. But in November 1988, Dorothea's web of lies began to unravel. A social worker contacted the Sacramento police to report a missing tenant, 52-year-old Alvaro Bert Montoya, a man with mental disabilities who had been staying at Dorothea's boarding house. The social worker was suspicious because Bert had disappeared without a word, and Dorothea's explanations didn't add up. When police arrived at 1426 F Street, Dorothea greeted them warmly, offering tea and cookies. She allowed them to search her property, but nothing seemed out of place at first. It wasn't until investigators noticed a freshly disturbed patch of soil in the backyard that things took a dark turn. What they uncovered would shock the nation. As police dug into the ground, they found the decomposed remains of one of Dorothea's tenants. The investigation quickly escalated, and over the following days, police unearthed 7 more bodies, each buried in shallow graves around the property. The chase and arrest. Despite the overwhelming evidence against her, Dorothea managed to charm her way into temporarily avoiding arrest. She convinced police that she needed to run errands and promised to return. Incredibly, they allowed her to leave, and she promptly fled to Los Angeles. For 5 days, Dorothea was on the run, staying in motels and trying to avoid detection. But her face was plastered on every news channel, and her story had captivated the country. A man at a bar recognized her from the news and alerted the authorities. Dorothea was arrested shortly thereafter and extradited back to Sacramento. The trial. Dorothea Puente's trial began in 1993 and lasted for 6 months, one of the longest trials in California history. Prosecutors described her as a manipulative predator who exploited society's most vulnerable for profit. They accused her of murdering 9 people, though she was ultimately convicted of 3 murders due to insufficient evidence in some cases. During the trial, Dorothea maintained her innocence, insisting that her tenants had died of natural causes and that she had simply helped bury them to avoid trouble. But the jury saw through her lies. She was sentenced to life in prison without the possibility of parole. Social services reforms? The case of Dorothea Puente exposed critical flaws in California's social services system. Many of her victims were sent to her boarding house by state agencies that failed to properly vet her or monitor the conditions in her home. The scandal prompted sweeping reforms to ensure better oversight of facilities for the elderly and disabled, as well as stricter background checks for caregivers. Life and death in prison. Dorothea spent the remainder of her life in the Central California Women's Facility. Even behind bars, she maintained the same quiet, grandmotherly demeanor, earning the trust of fellow inmates. She reportedly spent her days writing letters, reading, and cooking for other prisoners. Dorothea never admitted guilt, continuing to claim she had been misunderstood and scapegoated by the media. She died in 2011 at the age of 82, leaving behind a legacy of unanswered questions and unthinkable crimes. The legacy of the death house landlady. What makes Dorothea Puente's story so haunting is how perfectly she embodied the mask of kindness. To her neighbors, she was a sweet old lady who loved gardening and helping the less fortunate. To her tenants, she was a caregiver who offered them a safe place to stay. But behind that facade was a cold, calculating killer who exploited the most vulnerable members of society for her own gain. The house at 1426 F Street still stands today, now a private residence. It's become a macabre tourist attraction, drawing true crime enthusiasts and ghost hunters who are fascinated by its dark history. Some claim the house is haunted, with reports of strange noises and shadowy figures in the yard. Perhaps the spirits of Dorothea's victims, still searching for justice. Dorothea Puente's story is a chilling reminder that evil doesn't always come in the form of a masked killer or a shadowy figure lurking in the night. Sometimes it looks like a kind face, offering help when you need it most. For the victims she buried in her garden, and for the families who never saw their loved ones again, her legacy is one of betrayal and tragedy. And for the rest of us, it's a stark warning. Appearances can be deceiving, and even the most unassuming people can hide the darkest secrets. I was reading about Charlize Theron's incredible transformation in the 2003 movie Monster. The way she physically and emotionally became Aileen Wuornos was nothing short of haunting. But as I read more, I learned something even darker. The actress herself had endured a violent and traumatic past, with her own mother killing her abusive father in self-defense. That connection made me think about how someone could channel such a chilling real-life character like Wuornos, who lived a life of violence, betrayal, and desperation. Tonight, we'll dive into the case of Aileen Wuornos, one of America's most infamous female serial killers. Her story spans 1989 to 1990 in Florida, a tale of heartbreak, brutality, and a warped sense of justice that captivated the nation and inspired one of the most unsettling films in Hollywood history. A dark past, Aileen's early life. Aileen Carol Wuornos was born on February 29, 1956, in Rochester, Michigan, into a life that seemed cursed from the start. Her father, Leo Pittman, was a convicted sex offender who was in prison when she was born. He committed suicide by hanging in his cell when Aileen was just a toddler. Her mother abandoned her and her older brother, leaving them to be raised by their grandparents, who were strict and reportedly abusive. By her early teens, Aileen was living a nightmare. Her grandfather sexually abused her, and according to her own accounts, she became pregnant at the age of 14 after being raped by one of his friends. She was sent to a home for unwed mothers, where she gave birth to a baby boy who was immediately put up for adoption. Shortly afterward, Aileen's grandmother died, and her grandfather kicked her out of the house. Homeless and alone, she began living in the woods and surviving by engaging in sex work. These early years were marked by trauma, abandonment, and violence, an upbringing that seemed to set the stage for the crimes she would later commit. By the time she reached adulthood, Aileen was already hardened by life on the streets, moving from state to state, in and out of jail for petty crimes like theft and assault. Meeting Tyria Moore, a love that fueled the fire. In 1986, Aileen's life took another dark turn when she met Tyria Moore, a hotel maid at a Florida gay bar. The two quickly became inseparable, forming a volatile, codependent relationship. Aileen was fiercely loyal to Tyria, and the couple lived together, surviving off Aileen's sex work and petty scams. But as their financial situation grew desperate, Aileen began to spiral into a dangerous pattern that would make her infamous. Their relationship played a crucial role in the events that followed. Tyria later became a key figure in Aileen's trial, testifying against her in exchange for immunity. But during their time together, Tyria was Aileen's world, the one person she trusted in a life that had taught her to expect betrayal. The highway murders begin. By the late 1980s, Florida's highways were becoming dangerous places. Starting in late 1989, the bodies of middle-aged men began turning up along rural roads. Each victim had been shot at close range with a .22 caliber pistol. The killings followed a pattern. The men were picked up while traveling, robbed, and then executed. At first, police assumed they were dealing with a male serial killer. After all, the idea of a woman committing such violent crimes, especially against strangers, didn't fit the typical criminal profile. But when stolen items belonging to the victim started appearing in pawn shops, police uncovered a shocking lead. Witnesses described a disheveled woman who pawned a man's camera, and the handwriting on the pawn shop slips matched Aileen Wuornos, the arrest and confession. In January 1991, Aileen Wuornos was arrested at a biker bar in Volusia County, Florida. The arrest wasn't for murder, but for an outstanding warrant related to an earlier crime. Police were closing in on her, but they needed more evidence to link her to the murders. They turned to Tyria Moore, who had fled to Pennsylvania by then. In a calculated move, police brought Tyria back to Florida and placed her in a motel under their watch. They convinced her to call Aileen and coax a confession out of her. Over the course of several phone calls, Tyria begged Aileen to help her and take the blame for the killings. Whether out of love or guilt, Aileen confessed, saying she had committed the murders alone to protect Tyria. Her confession shocked the nation. She admitted to killing 7 men: Richard Mallory, David Spears, Charles Carskadden, Peter Seams, Troy Burris, Charles Humphreys, and Walter Antonio. But her motives were murky. Aileen claimed she acted in self-defense, stating that her victims had either tried to rape her or were otherwise violent. However, evidence at the crime scenes painted a different picture, with most victims showing no signs of a struggle. The trial and conviction. Aileen's trial began in January 1992, starting with the murder of Richard Mallory, a convicted rapist and her first known victim. The prosecution painted her as a cold-blooded killer who lured men with the promise of sex, robbed them, and killed them to avoid leaving witnesses. The defense argued that Aileen had been a victim of lifelong abuse and acted in self-defense. What sealed Aileen's fate was Florida's controversial Williams Rule, which allowed evidence from her other murders to be presented in court. The jury heard details of all 7 killings, and it became nearly impossible to argue that they were isolated incidents of self-defense. On January 27, 1992, Aileen Wuornos was convicted of first-degree murder for Richard Mallory's death. She was sentenced to death. Over the next 2 years, she received 5 more death sentences for the other murders. The final victim, Peter Seams, was never found, but his abandoned car had Aileen's fingerprints on it, further implicating her in his death. Life on death row. Aileen spent more than a decade on death row at the Florida State Prison, where her behavior became increasingly erratic. She claimed correctional officers were poisoning her food, and she gave bizarre interviews where she ranted about conspiracies and declared she wanted to die. Despite her unsettling demeanor, Aileen became a figure of public fascination. Journalists, filmmakers, and even sympathetic activists visited her, drawn to the complexities of her story. In 2001, Aileen fired her legal team and dropped her appeals, insisting she wanted to be executed. She claimed she had killed in cold blood and said she would kill again if released. "I have hate crawling through my system," she told reporters. "I'm one who seriously hates human life." Execution. On October 9, 2002, Aileen Wuornos was executed by lethal injection. Her last words were as strange as her life. "I'd just like to say I'm sailing with the rock, and I'll be back like Independence Day with Jesus, June 6th. Like the movie, big mothership and all. I'll be back." Aileen was the 10th woman to be executed in the United States since the death penalty was reinstated in 1976. Her case remains one of the most controversial in true crime history, with debates continuing about whether she was a cold-blooded killer, a victim of circumstance, or a tragic combination of both. The legacy of Aileen Wuornos. Aileen Wuornos' story became a symbol of societal failure, how poverty, abuse, and neglect can shape a person into something unrecognizable. Her case highlighted the dangers faced by women living on the margins of society and sparked discussions about the criminal justice system, mental health, and the death penalty. Her life was immortalized in the 2003 film Monster, for which Charlize Theron's transformative performance earned her an Academy Award. The movie captured Aileen's humanity and monstrosity, showing both her desperation for love and her capacity for violence. However, no movie or book can fully capture the complexities of her story, separating fact from myth. While Aileen's claim of self-defense has been widely discredited, her life and crimes defy easy categorization. Was she a predator who manipulated her past to gain sympathy? Or was she a broken woman who lashed out at a world that had been relentlessly cruel to her? The truth likely lies somewhere in between. What's clear is that Aileen Wuornos' story is a cautionary tale. It's a story of how unchecked trauma can fester and explode, leaving devastation in its wake. It's about how society often fails its most vulnerable, and how those failures can have deadly consequences. Aileen Wuornos wasn't the cigar-smoking outlaw like Bonnie Parker, nor the scheming landlady like Dorothea Puente. She was something different. A killer born from years of abuse, neglect, and survival on the fringes of society. Her story is haunting because it forces us to confront uncomfortable truths, not just about her, but about ourselves and the world we live in. These stories remind us of the dark potential within human nature and the importance of vigilance in protecting society's most vulnerable. Each case left a lasting mark on history, shaping how we approach criminal psychology, forensic science, and even public safety. If you found these stories compelling, please subscribe to my channel, where we continue to uncover the darkest corners of history. Let me know in the comments which case intrigued you the most, and I'll see you in the next video. Stay safe, and remember, not every monster hides in the shadows.